The moment didn't begin with a public statement. There was no formal address, no palace briefing, no immediate clarification offered to the world. And yet, within the private grounds of Sandringham House, something shifted. Quietly, deliberately, and with implications that extended far beyond a single residence. Because when legal representatives connected to King Charles III moved to restrict access to a specific wing of the estate, it wasn't framed as controversy. It was framed as protocol. But those familiar with royal structure understood immediately. This was not routine. It was containment. The decision, executed through legal channels rather than public messaging, effectively sealed off a private section of Sandringham long associated with independent use. Access permissions were revised. Internal movement was quietly limited, and the space, once considered flexible within royal arrangements, became suddenly inaccessible. No announcement explained it, but the absence of explanation became its own signal, because within the monarchy, access is never accidental. It reflects alignment that IT reflects authority, and when it changes, it reflects intention. At the center of that shift stood Queen Camilla, composed in public, unchanged in appearance, yet increasingly positioned within a structure that was subtly redefining boundaries. To observers, nothing appeared disrupted. Appearances continued. Engagements proceeded. The familiar rhythm of royal life remained intact, but behind palace walls, the recalibration had already taken effect, because the restriction was not about space alone. It was about control. Sandringham has long represented more than a private retreat. It carries historical weight, generational significance, and a degree of independence rarely associated with public-facing royal properties. To alter access within such a space is to signal something deeper, a reassertion of oversight, and that oversight, in this instance, was unmistakably legal. Advisors close to the structure understood the implications immediately. Legal authority had been exercised not reactively, but preemptively. Documentation had been reviewed, conditions clarified, boundaries formalized. Once implemented, those boundaries left little room for interpretation. For those expecting continuity in private arrangements, the shift felt abrupt. For the institution, it was procedural, because monarchy does not respond to expectation. It responds to structure. As days passed, the silence surrounding the decision remained unbroken. No direct acknowledgement, no visible dispute, only a subtle tightening of internal dynamics that those within proximity could not ignore. Because when a space is closed, it changes movement. And when movement changes, so does influence. Within palace circles, the adjustment was understood not as punishment, but as positioning, a way to reinforce clarity at a time when perception, scrutiny, and internal alignment carried increasing weight. The involvement of legal counsel underscored that reality. This was not symbolic. It was enforceable. And in a system where tradition often masks complexity, moments like this reveal the underlying mechanisms, the quiet instruments through which authority is maintained without spectacle. Publicly, the monarchy remained composed. Privately, it had shifted, because once access is redefined, relationships to space and to power are inevitably recalibrated. And Sandringham, long a place of retreat, had momentarily become something else, a boundary, unspoken, unannounced, but unmistakably in place. As with many changes inside the royal institution, the significance of this moment was not in how loudly it was communicated, but in how clearly it was understood by those who knew where to look. Because in monarchy, the most decisive actions are rarely declared. They are implemented, quietly, deliberately, and with consequences that unfold long after the doors are closed. And as the silence around Sandringham House continued, the true impact of the decision began to reveal itself, not through statements, but through adjustment. Because when a boundary is introduced inside a system built on hierarchy, everything around it begins to shift. Schedules subtly changed, movement became more deliberate. Access, once assumed, became defined. And within that recalibration, the role of Queen Camilla was quietly reframed. Not publicly, not ceremonially, but structurally. Her presence remained visible. Her engagements continued. Her composure, as always, remained steady. But within internal arrangements, the parameters had been clarified in a way that could not be ignored, because space within monarchy is never just physical. It represents autonomy. It reflects trust. It signals position. And when that space is restricted, the meaning extends far beyond walls and doors. For King Charles III, the decision reflected something deeper than reaction. It reflected intention, a reinforcement of order at a time when perception, both inside and outside the institution, carried increasing weight. Because the modern monarchy does not operate in isolation. It operates under observation, every movement analyzed, every silence interpreted, every decision placed within a broader narrative. And in that environment, ambiguity becomes risk, clarity becomes strategy. The legal ceiling of the Sandringham wing provided that clarity, not through explanation, but through action. It defined limits. It removed uncertainty. It established control without inviting confrontation. And that is how authority often functions within the royal structure, not loudly, but precisely. Behind the scenes, advisors adjusted accordingly. Internal planning reflected the new reality. Logistics were restructured to align with revised access. And those within proximity understood that this was not temporary. It was intentional, because temporary decisions are communicated. Permanent ones are implemented quietly. As days turned into weeks, the absence of public discussion became part of the story itself. No leaks, no direct confirmations, only a consistent pattern that reinforced the same conclusion. The boundary was holding, and when a boundary holds, it reshapes behavior. It influences proximity. It defines interaction. It subtly redraws a map of internal dynamics. For the monarchy, this was not disruption, it was calibration, a system refining itself in response to pressure, perception, and the need for stability. Because stability, in an institution built on continuity, is not maintained by avoiding change. It is maintained by controlling it. And in this moment, control had been clearly asserted. Yet, as with all such decisions, the long-term significance would not be measured immediately. It would be revealed over time. In patterns in consistency, in whether the structure created by this action continued to shape behavior long after the moment itself had passed. Because in monarchy, the most important question is never what happens in the moment. It is what remains afterward. And as the gates of Sandringham House stood unchanged to the outside world, what had changed within them continued to define a quiet but undeniable shift. One not announced, but understood. One not dramatic, but decisive. And in that quiet decisiveness, the monarchy once again demonstrated something fundamental about its nature. Power, when most effective, does not need to be seen. It only needs to be felt. The moment didn't begin with a statement. It didn't break across front pages. There were no alerts, no palace confirmations, no sudden interruption to the carefully managed rhythm of royal life. And yet, something changed inside Sandringham House that morning. Quietly, precisely, and with consequences that would ripple far beyond its private gates. Because when legal representatives acting on behalf of King Charles III moved to formally restrict access to a specific wing of the estate, it wasn't framed as punishment. It wasn't announced as discipline. It was executed as procedure. But within palace structure, procedure is often where power speaks the loudest. The residence itself has long stood as more than a country retreat. It represents autonomy, a space historically tied to personal discretion rather than public duty, a place where the monarchy steps briefly outside its ceremonial role. And that is precisely why the decision carried weight. Because access to Sandringham is never just about residence. It is about trust. At the center of the shift stood Queen Camilla, composed in public, unchanged in appearance, yet increasingly surrounded by a silence that insiders recognized immediately. Not confrontation, but distance. The restriction itself was subtle, and guards posted for spectacle, and visible barriers. Only internal directives, permissions adjusted, schedules revised, occupancy quietly redefined. But those who understand royal logistics knew what it meant. A boundary had been drawn. Behind closed doors, legal advisors reviewed estate governance frameworks tied to private royal properties. These are not casual arrangements. They are layered systems, trusts, usage rights, historical agreements, designed to preserve control across generations. Once activated, they leave little room for interpretation. And this time they have been activated. The timing raised questions, not publicly, but internally, because decisions of this nature rarely exist in isolation. They follow context, conversations, concerns, reputational calculations that never fully surface beyond palace walls. No official explanation was offered and no clarification requested, because within monarchy, silence often replaces narrative. Observers noted the absence more than any announcement. A canceled stay, a revised appearance, small changes, but in an institution where routine is everything, even the smallest deviation becomes significant. And then there was the role of Prince William, not visible in the decision, but present in its implication, because as the heir, his influence increasingly intersects with operational oversight, not in a way that challenges a sovereign, but in a way that supports long-term institutional stability. Decisions about access, optics, and alignment do not occur in isolation anymore. They are part of a broader recalibration. Inside advisory circles, the language remained careful. Words like alignment, consistency, and institutional clarity replaced anything resembling conflict, but the outcome remained the same. Access had changed, and in royal structure, access is everything. Meanwhile, the presence of Catherine, Princess of Wales, continued to provide a counterbalance. Her public engagements remained steady, her visibility reassuring, reinforcing a sense of continuity at a moment when internal adjustments risked quiet instability. Because while structural decisions happen behind closed doors, perception unfolds in public view. As days passed, the narrative did not escalate, that IT settled, and that settling revealed something deeper about how the modern monarchy operates. Not through confrontation, not through public correction, but through controlled recalibration, precise, measured, and often invisible to those outside its inner framework. The sealed wing at Sandringham did not become a headline, but it became a signal that boundaries still exist within even the most private corners of royal life, that a signal that access is conditional, and a signal that the institution, above all else, protects its structure, even when doing so requires quiet decisions that speak louder than any public statement ever could. Because in monarchy, power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply closes a door. The decision did not echo beyond palace walls, and an official briefing followed. An old spokesperson stepped forward to clarify intent, and yet, inside the quiet corridors of Sandringham House, the implications continued to unfold, slowly, deliberately, and with a precision that only those familiar with royal protocol could fully recognize. Because once a boundary is established within a monarchy, it does not remain symbolic for long. The IT begins to influence everything around it. Schedules adjusted first. Invitations, once routine, became selective. Private gatherings were reconsidered. Overnight stays, particularly those tied to long-standing personal habits, were quietly rerouted or removed altogether. Nothing dramatic, nothing abrupt, but enough to signal that the internal rhythm had shifted. For Queen Camilla, the change was not visible in public appearances. She continued her duties with the same composure, the same measured presence. But within royal structure, visibility is only one part influence. Proximity is the other, and proximity had been redefined. Behind the scenes, advisors aligned closely with King Charles III began reinforcing the legal framework that supported the decision. These were not new policies. They were long-standing mechanisms, rarely used, but always available, designed to preserve control over royal estates in moments where discretion became necessary. The use of such mechanisms sent a quiet but unmistakable message. This was not temporary. It was structural. Meanwhile, attention gradually shifted toward Prince William, whose role in the evolving dynamic continued to expand, not through declaration, but through presence. His involvement in estate oversight, advisory discussions, and long-term planning positioned him as a stabilizing force within a moment of internal recalibration. Not a participant in controversy, but a guardian of continuity. Inside palace circles, the language remained careful. No one described the situation as conflict. Instead, it was framed as alignment of expectations, a phrase that, within royal vocabulary, often signals a deeper realignment of authority. Because monarchy does not fracture outwardly, it adjusts inwardly. Observers began noticing patterns. Engagements once shared were now separate. Appearances that traditionally suggested unity were more measured, more deliberate. Even seating arrangements at private functions, details invisible to the public, reflected subtle recalibration. Nothing was accidental. Everything was intentional. And then there was the broader implication. Because Sandringham has always existed as more than a residence. It is a symbol of private royal life, a place where hierarchy softens and personal relationships take precedence. Restricting access within such a space does more than alter logistics. It reshapes dynamics. It redefines who belongs and under what conditions. For Catherine, Princess of Wales, her role during this period remained quietly significant. Her consistent public presence, combined with carefully balanced engagements, helped maintain a sense of continuity at a time when internal structures were subtly shifting. Because while decisions are made in private, stability must be projected in public. As weeks passed, the silence surrounding the situation remained intact. No leaks, no confirmations, only the steady continuation of royal duties, unchanged on the surface, but increasingly precise beneath it. And that precision revealed something fundamental about the modern monarchy. It does not